A knight's ballad about the Nomads. Twilight slowly descended on the castle walls as a cozy fire burned in the fireplace. It was the second half of the 13th century, somewhere in Europe. Sitting by the fire, the crusader hummed a song about the exploits of his youth. It was very eventful and filled with battles, a blood oath, marriage to a foreigner, and a long journey into a dangerous country. The knight's wife listened to the ballad while embroidering the tapestry with extraordinary patterns in the form of a ram's horn. The Qazaqs were able to create a whole tradition of dynastic marriages and diplomatic interaction with other peoples. The result of this story was an unprecedented alliance between the Crusaders and the Qazaqs. 3 weddings and 1 funeral, as well as the journey of a Frankish knight to the empire of Genghis Khan. How did the Qazaqs end up in Constantinople? These migrants arrived in Bulgaria. Why did the nomads fraternize with the Crusaders? This rite was necessary to confirm both the purity of a person as well as their attitude and their loyalty. And who remained behind the walls of Constantinople? He was buried according to the step rites of the Qazaqs. A battle between knights and Qazaqs, a blood oath between former enemies, the Pelopidan princesses, and the secret visit of the Crusaders to the descendants of Genghis Khan, the Golden Horde portrayed in a knightly ballad about nomads. Chapter 1. A Storm of Qazaqs. Time itself has imbued this building. Its traces can be seen on medieval frescoes, in streaks of antique marble, and on huge 24-meter columns. The Hagia Sophia. There was once a time when the Byzantine emperors, known as Basileus, passed through these doors alongside their retinue and guards. These imperial gates were said to have been made from the remnants of Noah's Ark. These days, tourists are greeted by a mere replica of one of the greatest of artifacts. The Crusaders made off with the original doors at the beginning of the 13th century. The Byzantine Empire was completely overrun during the Fourth Crusade. The force behind this crusade led to the sacking of Constantinople. It is one of the strangest episodes in world history. The Crusaders, also known as Franks or Latins, were on their way to liberate Jerusalem, but instead turned their attention to the Christian city of Tsargrad, better known as Constantinople, in 1204. The Knight's Code of Chivalry is an invention of later times. In fact, it was all far less romantic. After the capture of the city, the Roman Catholics spent 3 days causing incredible destruction, plundering everything that had been gathered over centuries in Constantinople. Neither churches, nor artistic monuments, nor private property were spared. Western knights and their foot soldiers, as well as Latin monks and abbots, took part in the robbery. Lev Gumilev, Byzantine Empire and the Crusaders. They entered the city, captured it, and created their own Latin Empire. The Byzantine Empire disintegrated, and separate states appear that stretch from the Balkan Peninsula to the Caucasus. Examples include the Nicene and the Trebizond empires. And almost immediately, and very remarkably, the Qazaqs entered this story. In 1205, only a year on from being seized, one of the cities conquered by the Franks, Adrianople, rebelled against the tyranny of the Crusaders. Tsar Kalayan of Bulgaria, with his relatives from the Great Steppe, rose to the defense of the city. In fact, during the period from 1185 to 1396, which is practically the entire period that the Second Bulgarian Kingdom existed, Bulgaria was ruled by the descendants of the Qazaqs. Some of the finest fighters in Europe, as they were known at that time, had learned a hard lesson. The knights, who had at first ridiculed the barbarians, were then completely routed by them. Kipchak horses could turn sharply back at full gallop, stop abruptly, crouch down or rear up. Naturally, many found it absolutely startling. Therefore, in all their battles with the Crusaders and with other knights, the Kipchaks won easily because of their mobility. The Latin emperor was taken away to a Bulgarian prison, where he promptly disappeared. The Crusader state never fully recovered from this blow, but it still continued to exist, and from then on, its main goal was the forging of strong alliances. While the Christians of the Occident waged war on those Christians in the Orient, clouds were gathering in the Far East. In 1206, the tribal assembly of the leaders of Mongolia, the Kurultai, proclaimed one of their tribesmen, Temujin, to be the emperor of the earth and gave him a new name, Genghis Khan. Georgy Vernadsky, Mongols and Russia. The chain of events that followed is well known to all. 4 decades of constant warfare. The shockwaves from this Mongolian tremor resulted in numerous mass migrations of the Kipchaks. Hungary. Pursued by the Mongol troops, the Polovtsian horde, led by one of the most famous Kipchak Khans, migrated to their Western European relatives. The widely known military commander Kotyan wasn't traveling to any old place. He rode to where he was expected, and King Bela, king of the Magyars, was waiting for him. The Kipchak Khan practically became a co-ruler with King Bela, and even a relative. He was generally called the grandfather of the kings of Europe. Kotyan's descendants reigned in Naples, the Byzantine Empire, and Serbia. They say that even Queen Elizabeth II is to some extent his great-granddaughter. According to one version of events, the Khan married his daughter to the Hungarian royal heir, while some say that the Kuban princess was simply a relative of Kotyan.
И почему кипчаки там остались? Потому что, во-первых, только они могли дать.
The Kipchaks remained there because, firstly, they alone could provide an effective defense against Batu's troops. Secondly, Hungary's landscape was ideal for grazing livestock on a large scale, so it was very suitable for nomads. Hungarian and German barons rebelled against the nomads, and soon the conspirators attacked the Khan in Pest. The attackers had the numerical advantage. Kotyan was killed. This was an Austrian nobleman. He personally led this conspiracy against Kotyan. The king was unaware of the existence of such a conspiracy. After the Hungarians and Germans dealt with Kotyan, the leader of the Kipchaks, these migrants arrived in Bulgaria. They did not simply arrive, they burst in, sweeping away everything in their path. Even the friendly Tsar of Bulgaria, it was no longer Kalayan, could not pacify the Polovtsians, who had lost their leader. And after a short time, the warlike nomads reached Constantinople. How did the Khans and the knights swear their blood oath? What else gave support to this strange alliance? And why did their alliance not last? Chapter 2. Blood Relations. The successful capture of Constantinople by the Crusaders and subsequently by the Ottoman Empire started from Galata. At the time of the events in question, one of the oldest towers in the world, together with its location, were considered a suburb of the capital of the Latin Empire. At that time, the boundaries of the empire had narrowed to the extreme. The Crusader leadership had been desperately trying to find allies among the kingdoms of Europe. And then the Polovtsians, who had amazed them several decades previously with their military prowess, arrived. They were hired to serve the emperors of the Latin Empire. It was perhaps 1239 or 1240. One way or another, the meeting definitely took place and was more than cordial. No one knows whether the Qazaq Khans, Jonah and Saronius, were taken aback by the amiable attention given to them, but the sources, albeit sparingly, record the communication between the former enemies in more detail.
История с Ионой, как союзника.
The story of Jonah as an ally of Emperor Baldwin II is recorded in the chronicles that are dedicated to the life of King Louis.
Короля Людовика.
And in order that they would aid one another at least once, the Latin emperor and other nobles let their blood and collected it in a large silver bowl. The king of the Cumans and other nobles who were with him did the same, mixing their blood with the blood of our people, pouring it into wine and water and drinking it. And our people did the same, and then they said in so doing they became blood brothers. Jean de Joinville, the Book of Pious Sayings and Good Deeds of our Holy King Louis. This alliance between the Polovtsians and the Franks, and in particular its initiation ceremony, had no historical precedent in Europe. However, for the Nomads, such a rite was an ancient tradition that had been practiced for thousands of years. This rite was necessary to confirm both the purity of a person as well as their attitude and loyalty. It is considered to be a terrible oath. If one takes such an oath, one never breaks it. This is an agreement that is set in stone. The ancient ritual also included the sacrifice of a dog. And judging by the records, the crusaders, the defenders of the Christian faith, were unfazed by the pagan customs of their new brothers. Moreover, they also became brothers in arms.
История с половецкими девушками, да,
The story concerning Polovtsian girls who would be married off was an integral part of Qazaq diplomacy. This is the very basis on which the Polovtsians were able to create a whole tradition of diplomatic interaction.
целую традицию дипломатического взаимодействия.
3 weddings took place at the same time. Unfortunately, the names of the brides have been lost to history. The first knight to take a wife was called Narjo de Toucy. He married into the family of the Cuman king Jonah. 2 more of the most prominent knights of the Roman Empire, Baudouin d'Hainaut and Guillaume de Méry, married the 2 daughters of the leader Saronius. Philippe Mousquez, the Chronicles of Rhyme. Everything seemed to be going well. Military campaigns were being planned, but suddenly the Qazaq Khan, most likely Jonah, died. His death was not a violent one. He must have simply passed away due to an illness. The noble Polovtsian was buried at the walls of Constantinople. They built a large mound which was filled with horses that had been offered up as a sacrifice, and they buried him according to the Qazaq steppe rite.
Известно, что похоронили либо в долбленных колодах, либо в так называемых решетках.
It is known that they were buried either in tree trunks or in so-called lattice graves. These were frames from carts or imitations of frames. Qazaqs believed that in the afterlife the deceased would get to the next world either on horseback or by cart.
На том свете они будут добираться либо на лошадях, либо посредством вот на телегах, на вазах.
Monsignor Narjo de Toucy told us of a great curiosity that he saw. When a noble knight died, they dug a huge and wide grave for him in the ground, and they put the best horse he had with him, and his best warrior would also be put in the grave, still living. The warrior, before he was lowered into the grave, bid farewell to the king of the Cumans and the rest of the noble lords, and while he was saying his goodbyes to them, large amounts of gold and silver were poured into his bag. Jean de Joinville, the Book of the Pious Sayings and Good Deeds of our Holy King Louis. According to these records, made by a direct participant in the events, It was not the Cuman king who died. Perhaps it was the already mentioned Saronius. Or was Jonah, contrary to the generally accepted version, not considered the most important of the Kipchaks?
Сохранилось вообще?
Has this burial been preserved? Has it been excavated and studied?
Похоже, что она не сохранилась.
No, it seems to have not survived. It has most likely been robbed. Nevertheless, it might be possible to look for his grave.
Могилу его можно.
The fraternal union of knights and Kipchaks fell apart no later than 1241, and it seems as though everything happened quite peacefully. Any sources to the contrary are silent. Where did the Kipchaks go? What was the eventual fate of the Poloptian women? And what kind of mission was waiting for the knight? Chapter 3. A Frank's Journey to the Steppe. His beloved wife spoke often of her homeland, but this was the first time the knight had found himself in such an unusual place. His experiences included the exotic scent of spices which were brought from distant India, unusual houses with warm floors, and palaces that were not made of any kind of stone.
Нельзя сказать, что эти декорации полностью...
These decorations don't fully recreate the look of the city. In fact, at times they are entirely inaccurate. For example, it is known that cities within the Golden Horde were mainly made up of one-story buildings, while here you can see a large number of multi-story settlements for the poor. Multi-storied buildings and palaces were very unique in the Golden Horde. Only Khans, emirs and other representatives of the nobility lived in palaces.
В дворцах жили ханы, эмиры, ну и прочие вельможи.
On his way to the Khan's residence, he even got lost in the narrow streets. Not everything in the Horde was built according to the same plans, but the cities of the steppe are similar to one another, be it in southern Kazakhstan or the region around the Volga. Thanks to his wife, he could understand a little of the Kipchak language. The Golden Horde is known as a period when many Central Asian cities were built. None of them are too dissimilar to Samarkand or Bukhara. And if the emotional state of a knight lost in an oriental city is a mere lyrical digression, then his journey to the Steppe Empire is a confirmed fact. Here are further details. The year is either 1249 or 1250. The Latin state continues to seek powerful alliances. Later, when the Golden Horde was created, the emperors naturally improved their relations not only with the Christian peoples, but also with those who were new to the region. The Kipchaks, who by then had become blood kin, moved into the camp of their enemies by joining the Bulgarians and the Greeks, the territory that is now modern Turkey. In the 13th century, the coast of the Aegean Sea fell within the lands of the Nicene Empire, one of the fragments of the Byzantine Empire. It was there that a separate Poloptian unit called Skifikon was based. Kipchak military contingents served as mercenaries in the Byzantine Empire, Bulgaria, Hungary, and many other neighboring countries. Nevertheless, during the short-lived brotherhood, the Franks were enriched by their experience of communicating with the Nomads and directed their gaze to the descendants of Genghis Khan, which had shocked the entire continent with their military campaigns. A marriage with a Poloptian princess was a decisive factor in the selection of a diplomatic envoy. Indeed, women played a certain role in the development of relations between many states and peoples with whom the Kipchaks interacted. By then, the son-in-law of Khan Jonah, Narjo de Tusi, had died, and his wife was in a nunnery. What happened to the second knight, Guillaume de Marie, and his wife is unknown, while the name of Baudouin d'Hainaut pops up in connection with the trip to the descendants of Genghis Khan.
C'est que souvent, ils étaient envoyés par les rois de France.
And if we speak only of French travelers, then they were often sent by the kings of those times. In particular, in 1253, the monk Guillaume Rubruck received an assignment from Louis IX. who was also called San Louis, to visit Mongi Khan.
C'était de rencontrer à Karakorum, en Mongolie, le grand Khan Monka.
А насчет рубрик, конечно, это очень...
Regarding Rubruk, of course, this is a very good example of relations between the West and the East, because he is one of the first travelers from Europe to come to Central Asia.
который из Европы приехал в Центральную Азию.
The monk followed the path of the knights, from Constantinople through the Qazaq lands, skirting around lakes Balkhash and Alakol, heading to the capital of the Mongol Empire. Thanks to Rubruk, information about the Crusaders' diplomatic mission to the Great Steppe has been preserved. Unfortunately, this consists of only 2 messages. One of them contains a geographical discovery, which is the first description of the Central Asian highlands. Throughout the journey, I noted only one thing that Baudouin de Hainaut had told me in Constantinople, who had been there. He ascended the entire route and never descended, for all the rivers flowed from east to west, either directly or indirectly, but with a slope to the south or north. Guillaume de Rubruk, A Journey to the Eastern Parts. The second mention is even more mysterious, and perhaps explains somewhat why there were no records left about the knight's journey to the descendants of Genghis Khan. What secrets do the traveller's diaries hide? How did the crusader become Sartak's advisor? And how did the knight's ballad end? Epilogue: The Khan's mysterious advisor. Somewhere in the steppes of Astrakhan and Atirau, by the standard route, the knight arrived at the palace of Sartak. The lord of the Ulus of Jochi insisted on being present, just as the arrival of regular guests from distant countries required. The presence of an enlightened European who knew the realities of the steppe was quite advantageous during the audience. One of the glorious knights of the temple lived at the court of Sartak, Batu Khan's son, and enjoyed the trust of the Mughals, often telling them about European customs and the power of the sovereigns there. Nikolai Karamzin, History of the Russian State. Who this knight could have been is still the subject of much debate amongst academics. Most believe that he was surely a Teuton, but he may well have been our crusader hero. At the very least, Rubruk confirms the data on the rather informal communications between Baudouin de Hainaut and Sartak, and there is a further point of contact. Sartak, who ruled before Berke, was a Christian. The Mongols were very loyal, regardless of religion. According to researchers, the knight's journey through the Horde lands lasted at least 3 years. He was also in the capital. But why were no records made, and what goals were pursued? To build a relationship with the powerful Khan was undoubtedly one of them. The other is most likely associated with the sea, or more precisely, the path between Constantinople and the Crimea conquered by the Chingizids. This had already been an initiative of the Venetians, where power in the Latin Empire had been shared with the Franks since the time of its conquest. This was the time when the Venetians dominated this region. They were all concerned with keeping the flow of goods from the east going. Was the mission successful? Unknown. But the Bosphorus trade route came into operation and brought a lot of profits to the Venetian merchants. Had military cooperation been established? Unlikely. However, there is one version of events where the union was indeed formed. The negotiation process at the main headquarters is shrouded in secrecy, but this may be a completely different story. The history of a great geopolitical game. It is unlikely that this story will be told to your grandchildren in front of a cozy fireplace. Here we have adventures in eastern cities, a trip to a distant country, a wedding with a stranger, a ritual of mixed blood. They sound much more mysterious. The whole ballad about Nomads turns out a little sad and very mysterious. After all, the eventual fate of the knight and his Poloptian woman has never been mentioned anywhere else.